Okay, so introduction to the mother's house. I have to prepare us because we have never been there. We are used to, most of us, we are used to sitting in the father's house, right? We are used to seeing things in a father's house perspective. So we need to talk about this new house, this new space that we will inhabit for the class, and also go through an initiation process, right? So that we're ready. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the Bible in general, and then we'll go slowly into that direction. So, first of all, right, I want to begin with this observation that I have had over the years that I've been alive is of the Bible as one of the most misunderstood books, right? The Bible in a way, or not misunderstood for sure, but also one of the most misused books, right? For centuries, right, the Bible has been used to condemn, to judge, to oppress, and to kill, right? We know this historically, which is why somebody who usually doesn't have a background in religion is probably going to be like, this is not for me, right? This text is a text that has been used as a weapon of oppression of other religions, of women, of the LGBT community, right? And this is not a book for me, right? A lot of us think like that. Not so much in this class, but in general, right? Were I to teach this class to general public, I would start like this, right? I would start with the awareness that most of us have that the Bible has been one of the most misused books and has been a weapon of oppression. And for good reason, right? There is in the Bible a strong patriarchal perspective. There are a lot of passages in the Hebrew Bible that are sexist, that are racist, right? That are ethnocentric. But what we often don't know, right, is that there's also a whole subculture in the Bible which goes against this, right? So make sure you write this down, right? That the Bible does have a dominant culture, which is patriarchal, number one, which is sexist, number two, although this is really disputed. There is some racism involved in the Hebrew Bible, and certainly you have the I think I said that already, the ethnocentric part. So patriarchal, ethnocentric, and sexist. We'll start with that, right? So make sure you write these 3 points, right? That it's true that the dominant culture, you can find a lot of examples of the Bible being sexist, patriarchal, and ethnocentric, right? So what we don't know, right? And I believe this is because the readership of the Bible has been sexist, patriarchal, and ethnocentric, right? They have not seen that the Hebrew Bible also has a whole subculture which actually subverts all three of these categories, right? There's a whole subculture which subverts patriarchy, which subverts the ethnocentric culture of the Bible, and which subverts the sexist culture of the Bible also, right? And this is the subculture we're going to be following, right, in this class. So give me 2 seconds, Giannakopoulos. Let me just give a few examples of this, right? For example, you have the book of Ruth, which we're going to study, and we're going to see that this book of Ruth was written in response to a tendency in among the Jews to become more and more ethnocentric. Like, we are the pure, everybody is corrupt and tainted, and we need to separate ourselves from the nations. At the moment where this mentality was developing in the Hebrew mindset, the book of Ruth was written as a subversion of that, and we're going to see that in detail, right? The book of Esther, which in my view is a book, one of the most powerful feminist books of the Hebrew Bible, right? You have a very strong female character. We're not studying the book of Esther, but you can read it, right? She's a very strong female character. She bears the name actually of the goddess Ishtar. So she has this kind of goddess energy, right? So for those of us who think that the goddess, there's no room for the goddess in the Hebrew Bible, it's not true. You have a couple goddesses of a whole books dedicated, right, to goddess-like figures, and the book of Esther is one of those. Very strong a message of female empowerment in that book, right? Where she goes from being a mere concubine to being a queen who rules on the same throne as her husband, right? So this is a very interesting book. You have the Song of Songs, where you have the main character again as a woman, but she's not even a Hebrew woman, she's a black woman. And she is in fact teaching in this book about love, right? And we're going to be studying this particular book. So here again, you have this kind of subversion of the ethnocentric, right, Jews only approach, right, to life, to wisdom, to God. Here you have an African woman who is doing the teaching, right? And then, of course, you have, even if you look in the book of Genesis, you have a perpetual subversion of patriarchy among the matriarchs, right? We won't study those passages, but you can read them, right? Genesis 12 on, you have very strong female figures who are acting side by side, sometimes against their husbands, and participating in the course of the chosen people, right? So very interesting. So you have a whole subculture, you have a whole undercurrent of subversion of patriarchy in the Hebrew Bible. You have a whole lot of very strong female characters. You have entire books dedicated to female characters. And these books are usually chipping away at the patriarchy, at the ethnocentric perspective, and at the sexism that you find often interspersed throughout the Hebrew Bible. Giannakopoulos, go ahead.
Yeah, Professor, I just want to say I completely agree with you. I think there are a lot of moments when the Bible it is sexist, racist, or even patriarchal. And what happens is, I think nowadays especially, they take pieces of it, and those certain pieces get thrown around instead of the whole text itself, you know? So people will see these certain pieces of the text and it's like, oh my gosh, the whole thing must be like this,
Yeah,
when it's not true at all,
exactly.
you know? But
Right.
I think that's what happens, especially nowadays.
Absolutely. We have focused, the readership nowadays has focused on these patriarchal bits, right? Or on these sexist bits, mostly because most of the people who are commenting on the Bible still today are male, right? You have very few women in seminaries, very few women as priests, very few women as pastors. Some denominations are still forbidding, right, women to become pastors. So you have really still a dominant, the dominant readership, um, the dominant readership, and the ones who are interpreting and teaching the Bible are still very much male and still very much informed by Greek culture, which we're going to talk about and discover why this is so problematic as we study the book of Genesis, right? So this is why it's so important, and I'm so glad in this class that we have a broad audience of different backgrounds, right? It is so important for this reason to broaden the readership of the Hebrew Bible, right? As long as the Hebrew Bible is read by European males, we're going to see this much, right? Very narrow perspective of the European male. And we will not discover these other texts because they're of no interest to somebody who is wanting to maintain the patriarchal order, right? So this is why it's so important to broaden the readership to women, to broaden the readership to the LGBT community, to broaden the readership to different ethnic groups, to even different religions need to be reading the Bible, because that is the only way we will begin to tap into these other voices, which are there, but which can only be heard by someone who is already vibrating on the same frequency, right? If you're a male, you're not going to hear the women's voices. Just like if you're female, you won't pay attention to the male voices. If you're straight, you're going to miss the whole fluidity, gender fluidity that is present in the Hebrew Bible, right? And so forth. So it's very important to broaden the readership, and this is why I'm teaching this book in this university context, because I'm getting a broader readership here. And this class has been in the past magical, right? Because precisely so many different people, especially if you come from a complete non-background of religion, right? If you don't have a religious background, it's the best, because you're really reading the text with a clean slate. You don't have all of the baggage that some of us have who have a religious background, right? And other people from other religious backgrounds can see things that the typical Christian or Jew who is reading the Bible does not see, right? So important to broaden the readership so that we can become attuned to these other voices, right? Okay, so like I told you, right, in this particular class, we will focus on this more feminine voice, right, the mother's house. And so I want to look into a little bit how this voice is going to sound different, right? Where is this voice going to take us? Where is this mother's teaching going to take us? And how is it different from the father's teaching, right? Now, again, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying the father's teaching is wrong. It's not, right? Everything that you learn in the father's house is good and excellent, but we need the balance with the mother's house, right? You having both is ideal, right? So when I'm doing this class, I'm not talking about rejecting the teachings of the father's house, which is the teachings of that most of us have received, right? What I'm saying is that it's good to also hear a little bit from the mother, right? I think the book of Proverbs says, listen to your father's teaching and do not abandon your mother's wisdom, right? There's a text like that which brings both the father and the mother as having something important to say. And sadly, in our Western culture, we have privileged the father's house and we have neglected the mother's house, which in my view has led to an imbalance in the way that we see God, in the way that we see gender relations, and in the way that we see our own spirituality, our own humanity, right? So we need to bring back these texts. So let me say a few words first on the father's house, what characterizes the father's house, and then I'll contrast it with the mother's house. So number one, I'm going to look at 4 points. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, number one, make sure you write these down. These are important. Number one, the concept of God. Okay, in the father's house, God is male. Pronoun he, right? Usually this God is distant, right? This God is also very interested or very kind of obsessed with sin and transgression, right? It's very important in front of this God to not sin, right? So the emphasis in the father's house is refrain from sinning. Again, nothing wrong with that. This is good advice, right? But this is the emphasis, right? So this is usually a God who is emphasizing the importance of not transgressing, of not sinning, and also there is an element of punishment, right? We have several texts about if you choose life, right? If you choose, how is it put in Deuteronomy? Yes, if you obey my commandments, you will have life. If you disobey my commandments, you will be cursed, right? This is the typical father's house teaching. If you do not obey these commandments, if you sin, if you transgress, you will suffer, you will be cursed. The wages of sin is death, right? Another father's house teaching, right? Again, all very important. The key will be in this class to be able to think on both levels, right? I'm never going to ask you to discard the teachings of the father's house because the father's house is the teaching of the father. It's important. It's the whole half of creation, right? But I'm going to say hold this, but also try to hold this, right? This is going to be the difficulty. I'm not going to ask you to choose. I'm going to say, okay, you have received this is good, but now taste this also, right? Okay, so that's the first thing, right? This is a God which is punitive often, right? Which is a God which has no tolerance for transgression and sin, right? In the presence of God, you cannot approach because we are sinful. That's the first thing. Any questions on that one? Everything good with this, the God in the Father's house as he's usually portrayed? Okay. All right, great. Oh, hello, Anderson. You made it. Good, good. I'm glad to see you. Okay, great. Back to speaker view. All right. Point number 2, Father's house. Focus, the worship is usually done in the temple, at least in the Hebrew Bible. The temple is the focal point, right, of the presence of God is found in the temple, nowhere else. In fact, the temple is extremely important. We'll have to talk about this, especially when we talk about the book of John, which is a kind of post-temple book, right? But the temple, we have to measure the importance, was really seen to be the dwelling place of God on earth. No temple, no God, right? It's a very focal point, very central point. So the whole spirituality in the Father's house is centered in the temple and on the rituals of the temple, the sacrifices that take place in the temple, right? And usually, of course, the temple is, the priests are male, right? There's no female priests, obviously. And also, of course, women are largely excluded from this service. If you're aware of how the temple was built, you had the Holy of Holies, which was God, then the holy place, which is where the priests are working. Then you have the male court, and then the female court. So really on the outskirts, right, you have the women coming. Even today, if you go to a synagogue, right, the women are usually on the gallery, right? They're not doing any of the prayers. They're not participating in the rituals or in the reading of the text, right? They are on the sitting on the balcony, right? Usually chit-chatting among themselves about what they're going to eat next. And I know I've been there. So, okay. So you can see how this is here in the Father's house, right? And still today in Christianity, right? We are following this in a way when we say that only male can be priests, right? When we have a kind of the center point is the church and the rituals of the church. This is a very Father's house approach, right? Okay, number 3. Yes, rule-based, ritual-based, right? The rules are very important. The commandments are very important, right? To love God is to keep his commandments, right? So there's a high emphasis on this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do. American Christianity is very much like that still, right? This idea that the Bible says you should do this, the Bible says you shouldn't do that, and that's end of story. That's it. That's what it boils down to, right? God said do this, God said don't do that. Figure it out, right? So very much an emphasis, especially in evangelical Christianity here in our country, on following meticulously the principles, the rules, the commandments of God, not questioning, right? And especially not transgressing, right? Very important emphasis on purity, on sanctity, on holiness, right? This idea that, and of course the importance of the rituals and so forth, right? And then finally, Father's house, holiness is seen as separation, the importance of separating ourselves from the world, right? Especially you had this in the context of the Hebrew, especially during the time of Jesus, right? We could see that how the Hebrews saw their destiny as distinct from the nations, right? We need to purify ourselves from the influence of the nations, and we need to stay pure and holy for God, right? So separation from the world. Still today you see this in Christianity, especially American Christianity, right? Where you have the idea of we cannot be of the world, right? We cannot go to this party or go visit this or read this or listen to that or date this, right? A lot of, prohibition in terms of entering or walking or mingling with the world. There is a lot of warning, right, about that. Okay, is everything clear with the Father's house? Are we good? Now, again, right, this is all excellent advice. Disclaimer, I'm not going to say this is wrong. It's not. There's a lot of good, right, in this perspective. But again, it is missing the mother's house element, and therefore, in my view, it is out of balance. So let's go now into how the mother's house is going to nuance each one of those 4 points. And if you understand this, you'll be ready to enter the texts of the mother's house, and you will navigate smoothly in the texts we are about to study. So number 1, God, right? We saw Father's house, God. God is male, transcendent. He's no tolerance for transgression and so forth. So here's what we're going to discover. And now we're getting into a place where some of us, right, will be uncomfortable, but I want you to embrace this discomfort as a moment of growth, right? No growth without discomfort. Mother's house God, you will notice, right, is actually a God who is very close, immanent God, right? Not transcendent. It's a God which is not so much judging transgression as facilitating growth and individuation. Let me say that again. It's not so much a God that is judging transgression from above, right, as a partner of our growth and our individuation. So God is more here seen as a partner in our development, rather than a God sitting on a throne looking down and, you did this and you did that, and let me write this in my book, right? This is a God who is right there trying to nurture our growth, right? So this is a God actually which has a very high tolerance for transgression. Why? Because this God in the mother's house is seeing transgression as a vehicle for growth and maturation. I hope some of you are already sweating with discomfort. You should be, right? Let me say it again. This is a God who has a very high tolerance for transgression and sin, because this is a God who sees these as opportunities for redemption, for growth, for maturation. And so this is a God who actually rejoices. I'm going to go very far here. We're going to see some of this in the book of Genesis. This is a God who actually rejoices with the sins and mistakes and chaos of our lives and sees these as opportunities for creativity. Okay, so this is a God who's very creative, right? And as soon as this God sees chaos, it's like, ooh, yes, let me see what I can do with this chaos, right? Sees a big transgression, a big mistake, a big fatal thing you did to ruin everything. This God actually is like, ooh, let me see what I can do now. Let me take this thing and make something of it. So this is a very kind of cheerful God, right? Very tolerant of transgression, actually excited when something is going wrong, because this is an opportunity for this God to make it right. Are you following? Everybody's you should be already like exploding inside with this idea of a God who is tolerant of transgression. What religion says this, right? What world you have a God who is like, ooh, a transgression. Let me see what I can do with it. Let me see how I can arrange this transgression into, right? This is the kind of God we will see, especially in the book of Genesis. I see a couple questions. Okay, I'll start with Rudolph and then Janakopoulos. Go ahead.
First up, I think I'll be moving to mother's house since transgressions are embraced. But I want to ask the identification between mother's house and father's house. I have never heard before in the context of the Bible. Is it actually a standing definition?
Yes, so it's not, there's no standing definition, but there is a mention of the mother's house in several passages, right? And this intrigued me. This is what gave me the idea, right? So there's a mention of mother's house, whereas usually we speak of the father's house, right? So the mother's house is mentioned in the book of Ruth, and it's mentioned in the Song of Songs, right? And so this gave me the idea, especially as I was studying these two books, that we have an alternative path here, right? Which is alluded to, because it's a subculture. We are in patriarchy in the Hebrew Bible. It's established. That's the culture of the time. So it's hinted, it's subtle, it's elusive, right? And I'm jumping on this subtlety and I'm making a whole class about it, right? So it's there, but it's not, and you'll discover it as we study the text. You will see the radiance of this mother's house. You will see how different it is from the father's house. But yes, the concept of mother's house is alluded to in the Hebrew Bible, and I'm kind of just deepening that concept here. Does that make sense, Rudolph?
It does. I mean, I remember Rebecca moving into the mother's house, but that's
Yes.
just about the only memory I have of
That's
Genesis.
the third one. Thank you. That's the third one. Isaac brings Rebecca into his mother's tent, right? So again, an allusion here to the mother's house. Absolutely. But you will find this concept in the book of Ruth if you read it, and we'll read it together. And in the Song of Songs, it's mentioned I think a couple times, actually. It's very important. Giannakopoulos, go ahead.
I think one of my favorite examples of you saying the mother's house is the father and the prodigal son. The
Yes.
prodigal son, he left his house, took his inheritance, did whatever he wanted, sinned out the wazoo. And the second he came back, he was accepted. It was rejoicing. There was no punishment. And he was given a ring, a set of new clothes, even though all he wanted to do was be accepted as a slave, a servant. And it's like the best example one can give,
Yes,
because
it's excellent.
he was given so many opportunities to come back, and the second he came back, they threw a party and he was completely rejoiced, which is like,
I mean, you
yeah.
will see that we will do just a little bit of the teachings of Jesus, but if you go deeper, Jesus is full on in the mother's house. I mean, that's his thing, right? This is the best way to understand his teachings, I think. If you read him as as a teacher, which is in residence in the mother's house, you really understand what he's doing, right? Which I think Christianity is drifting from powerfully right nowadays, right? We have made Jesus as a father's house theologian, where actually when you read the text, and you will see how his teachings are in the continuity of the Hebrew wisdom literature that you find in the mother's house. If we can move him back into the mother's house, which is where he is, I think we will really understand Christianity much more, at least these teachings, right? By the way, just to add to what you're saying, you're inspiring me, Giannakopoulos. Do you remember, I think all of you know this story, or a lot of you know this story of Jesus when he was 12. He's brought to the temple by his parents, And he ends up staying there among the scholars, right? And his parents go back home, but he's loving it so much in the Father's house, right? He's in the temple, he's with the rabbis, he's enjoying this moment. And his mother comes back and she fetches him, right? And he reluctantly goes back with her, right? Because he is, as a man, as a male, as a son, right? He's enamored. The Father's house has a powerful magnetic power over Jesus, but the mother brings him back with her. One of the deeper meanings of this gesture is that she's signaling to him, this is not your house, right? This is not the kind of teacher you will become. Yes, there is beauty. I know you're attracted. I know this is magnetic to you, but you belong in the mother's house, right? This is one of the ways that I interpret that story, right? So yes, definitely one of the ways to really, I think, reconcile ourselves with Christianity is to go back to seeing Jesus as a mother's house, as being in residence, right? A teacher in residence in the mother's house. I think this will clarify a lot. Let's see, there's a couple more questions. Williams, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is actually quite interesting because the way God is portrayed contemporarily in terms of popular culture, there's been a lot more nurturing God and less confines of him being like like you said, a punitive person. It's very interesting, like you're mentioning that, like it's two separate views of the same character as we'll just, because like most of contemporary culture over the last, like, I think 3 years, they've had more portrayals of God this way.
Yeah, we're moving really back to the mother's house in our civilization because the woman's voice is becoming stronger, right? So automatically, right, we're reclaiming, right, these teachings. So, and this class is part of this trend, right? So very good. Yes, of course, the society is following. Let's see. I think let me continue, right? If you have more to say, I'll get you a little later down the path. So you can put down your hands for now, and I'll catch you later. Okay. Second thing, temple, right? The temple is the center in the Hebrew Bible, right? It's a male-dominated, how shall I put it, system, right? Now, what we're going to see with the mother's house is a move from the temple to the garden. I want to emphasize this right now because it's so interesting. I just realized this today as I was thinking about it. You have the garden, which reappears several times in the mother's house texts. You have in the book of Genesis, of course, the Garden of Eden, but then you have again in the Song of Songs, the whole setting as a garden, right, instead of the temple. You have the garden or the field with Ruth, or everyday life, right? So, but let me start here with the garden because this is significant and I want to talk about this a little bit. How do I begin to talk about the garden without going into too much details? Let me put it like this. If you're familiar with, and we'll talk about this again when we do the book of Genesis, right? But in the ancient Near East, where the Bible was composed, right? You had the Hebrews, but you also had the whole Near Eastern culture of the time. This culture was very different from the Hebrew Bible. They emphasized temples, or what we'll study in Genesis 11, ziggurats. Everybody knows what this is, a ziggurat? This is like a temple that goes up like this, you know, like a pyramid, kind of. This was the thing at the time, right? So the religion at the time was centered on temple and on human beings offering food to the gods at these temples, right? This was the spirituality of Sumer, right? Or in Mesopotamia, right? Which is the time, right, of course, where the Hebrew Bible was written, but of course in a very different way. So the spirituality of the time, when the book of Genesis especially was written, was a spirituality centered on the ziggurats, on the temples, which we will study in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. It's a ziggurat, right? And the idea of these temples was that human beings were supposed to come and bring food to the gods and feed the gods and work for the gods, right? Now, we're going to see when we talk about the garden theology, right? This is the reversal. It's no more human beings who give to God, it is God who gives to human beings. So versus an active duty spirituality, you have a receptive spirituality, right? So let me say that again. The garden is a metaphor for a spirituality which is receptive rather than a spirituality which is doing for God, right? Which is the temple spirituality. Temple spirituality, you come, you worship, you obey, you keep the commandments, you do the rituals, you do, and God will accept you. Garden spirituality, right, is God working for us instead of us working for God. It's God giving us the food instead of us feeding the God. It's God providing versus us striving. This is the garden spirituality that we will see all over the place. We will see it in the book of Genesis, that's the foundation text. We will see it in the book of Ecclesiastes, this notion of receptivity versus doing. We'll see it in the Song of Songs, right? This is a very important concept that I wanted you to right away start to grasp, right? Are you sensing the contrast here between garden and temple? Everybody good? Rudolph, do you have a question about that?
No, I don't know why the hand is up. I don't know how to release it now that I figured out how it works. I don't know.
I'll let you struggle with that a little more then. Okay. Great. Then extension of the garden, the field with Ruth. Extension of the field, everyday life. What we're going to see in the mother's house is that spirituality is centered on ordinary life. Spirituality occurs between people, in our interactions, in the way that we live, in the way that we embrace life, penetrate life, in our despair, in our joys, in our lovemaking, in our anger. This is where spirituality occurs. This is where we encounter God, not in the temple, right? You see that we are leaving behind the walls of Jerusalem. We're leaving behind the temple structure, and we are now encountering God in daily life, right? Daily life. When you're going through despair, God. When you're making love to your partner, God. When you're anxious about something, God. When you're interacting in a relationship, God. Okay, this is where we find God in the mother's house, right? The mother's house, the encounter with God takes place outside of the structures. It takes place in everyday life, in these mundane moments or feelings that we go through. That's where we encounter God, right? That's the extension of the garden. Okay, so we'll talk, of course, about that, especially in the book of Ecclesiastes and Job. We'll see that. Okay, any questions on the temple versus garden / field / or ordinary life? Are you all clear? And that's very important. If you get this, you're ready for the next. Okay, third, a contrast. The rules, the rituals of the father's house, very important. In the mother's house, they're all gone. No more rules. No more commandments, no more rituals. All that is left now is sacrificial love, which is much harder. Okay? So the rules and the rituals are replaced. The sacrifices, right? The animal sacrifices are replaced with an attitude of sacrificial love. The mother's house teaches love. And because she teaches love, she doesn't need to teach anything else because love is the destination. All of the rules, the rituals, what do you think they're here for? To teach us to love. So the mother's house goes straight to the heart, right? Says, let me just teach you to love, and then you'll be fine. You don't need that other stuff. I think St. Augustine says it really well. He says, love and do what you want. It's a beautiful quote. I love this. This is like the only quote I like from him. Love and do what you want. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what he said. St. Augustine, church father, right, from the Middle Ages. Right? So love and do what you want. This is the mother's house. Mother's house says, as long as you're loving, you will know what to do. If you're working, if you're acting, if you're speaking from a place of love, you will do the right thing. You don't need to check in your Bible what is the right thing to do. Check your heart. You're listening to your heart. You're acting from a place of love. You don't need a manual. You don't need a recipe. You will know what to do. And so the mother's house is telling us, let me teach you to love. Because if you know this, you will know everything else. Right? Giannakopoulos, go ahead.
I love that you say that because in one of the epistles, I don't remember who it was from. I think it was from Peter, but he was saying that you can do works of miracles, you can have the power of healing, you can be a priest, a preacher, all these amazing things. But if you do not have love, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven.
Corinthians.
So yeah, Corinthians. Thank you. That I knew it was. So even if you have all these amazing things, it doesn't matter because without love, nothing matters.
Yeah, Giannakopoulos' quoting the famous, beautiful, beautiful poem on love that Paul wrote in the Epistle of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13, right? This is pure mother's house, right? Very good. Nice connections. I'm enjoying your connections. You're really helping us enjoy Christianity.
I think like in my church, we actually talk a lot about, we get taught a lot from the mother's house,
Yeah.
more so than other churches. Like I think I mostly have been taught from the mother's house, you know, love is definitely above all, you know, so.
I will tell you why, because you're a Greek Orthodox. Let me give you a history lesson. One of the problems with the church is that it became heavily influenced by Roman politics, right? When the church became Roman, it became very patriarchal and misogynistic and intolerant because it was infiltrated by the elements of the Roman Empire. And so the church we have today in the US is still, you know, reeling from this, right? Still in the continuity of this. The church that Giannakopoulos belongs to is the Greek Orthodox Church, which occurred in the East, away from Rome. And so there's a lot of stuff there that hasn't been touched by the Roman Empire, which is why what you're saying, that the mother's house is more present in the Greek Orthodox, makes sense, because the Roman Empire was not able to infiltrate that version of Christianity, right? Whereas the Christianity we have, sadly, right, in the West, is very much influenced by Rome. And this is why there's so much patriarchy, intolerance, violence in our history, right, as Western Christians, right? So thank you, very good. Okay, last one. Holiness as separation, Father's house, right? We need to stay away from the world. Mother's house is like, bring it on, right? Mother's house is like, let's go, let's get into this world. You're from the world, come in, right? Mother's house is welcoming of the stranger, welcoming of the pagan. Mother's house loves pagans, loves foreign philosophies, loves these different ways of seeing the world. Mother's house wants to enter the world. Mother's house is Nietzsche, right? Really, you will see so much in the mother's house of inclusivity and diversity. These are the two main virtues of the mother's house, inclusivity and diversity. And we will see a lot of this in the story of the Tower of Babel, in the Ecclesiastes, the book of Ruth, John, Gospel of John, that we have a lot of this notion that the world is really a place we need to enter if we truly want to encounter God. God will not be encountered away from the world. God will be encountered within the world. We have to have the courage to penetrate into life, enter the messiness of life, because this is where God is waiting for us. That's what the mother's house teaches, right? Go ahead. You have a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah. I guess what you were saying, like in the beginning of class, to kind of not discard one over the other, but like I guess I feel like as I'm taking these notes, it's like they're going opposite directions as we like, but like
no.
so like how are you supposed to reconcile between the two? Like I don't know, for example, holiness is separation, that's the Father's house, right?
Yep.
But like at the same time you do whatever you want in a sense, like it's
Good
yeah.
Let me give you an answer that Jesus gives. He says it very well. This is a parable he gives, which is about being the salt of the earth, right? Okay, be the salt of the earth. Now, if you're the salt, you should be the salt, right? You should not be something else. We agree. Don't try to be pepper or sugar, right? Salt. But what do you have to do? Is the salt supposed to remain in the salt shaker? Where's the salt supposed to go? Oh.
It's supposed to, you saying the salt and light of the world, so I guess the people around you.
You have to enter the world, right? To truly be the salt of the world, but you have to be salt. So you see how you can blend the two. I think this is what Jesus is doing masterfully. He's saying, yeah, be the salt, but don't stay in the shaker like you've been taught in, because the Father's house takes it to an extreme, right? It says, be so salty that you never leave, right? Jesus is saying, no, be the salt. Yes, be strong salt, right? But you have to enter the world if you're going to make a difference, right? So Jesus here is merging very, very nicely the Father's house with the mother's house teaching.
See, but salt, I guess, in a sense, would still hold its content, hold like
you have to.
its virtues and.
But
I
you have
see.
to penetrate the world. You have to mingle with the world. You have to assimilate. The salt actually to really work has to disappear into the food, right? If you have a clump of salt that in your food that's still a clump of salt, you're gonna eat. It's gonna be disgusting, right? So the salt actually has to merge to the point where you don't even sense that the salt is there. You see how powerful this teaching is, and yet it still has to be salt, right? So there is a possibility, and I think Jesus was masterful in the way that he could bring the two worlds together, especially in that parable, that yes, you have to be yourself, but you have to be yourself to the point that it's not noticed anymore.
So would you say that's like the hard part, I guess, throughout the centuries of Christians, like trying to figure out the fine line between
Yeah.
the two?
Absolutely. This is
Is
the
that why?
difficulty. And we've gone in the extreme of the Father's house, which is separate, everyone is sinful, and they should come to us. And, and we've gone to the extreme, right? I mean, the ideal in the Father's house of separation is necessary, but the Mother's house will say separate in order to connect. Mother's
See.
house adds a teaching here, right? Whereas the Father's house sometimes takes it too far and says the separation itself is good for itself, right? And you have then all of the monastic um, tendencies in the Father's house, right? To really isolate, right? And the Mother's house would say, well, it's good to separate, but to separate in order to be better able to commune, right? So that's the idea. So this will be the difficulty. You're pointing out that they are extremes, they are opposites. And the sign of the genius here will be able to hold both of them together. And I think Jesus is one of the people who masterfully did this. Another person who did this very well is King Solomon, which we're going to talk about, right? But yes, we will be emphasizing, of course, the Mother's house. I'll be leaving a little bit the Father's house aside for the class. But if you are, but the ideal, right, is to be able to hear both teachings, right? Because both are wise, and then to make your own path. And this is which each one of us will have to choose, right? How to do that. Make
But
sense?
I have one more thing though. I feel like for the Mother's house, we can kind of take it to the extreme also in a sense too, if it's equally possible.
Explain
Like,
how? Go ahead, tell me.
um, I mean, I feel like um, just how I guess the Father's house with these certain like rules and like how the Father's house is built up. Um, like you said, we do take it to the extreme, but I feel like equally true, like, and it's possible too, like taking the Mother's house, like, I wouldn't be surprised, or I wouldn't be like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if I guess, we can also like take it to the extreme in a sense.
Yes, I think that's plausible to, we'll have to see how as we go into it. I'm interested actually in hearing you as we get deeper into the Mother's house, tell me, here, this is to the extreme, right? I tend to be, I have to admit, I tend to be sympathetic to the Mother's house. It is a house of perfection, but it's not good. It's not good. I admit it. I admit it. So I'm very, very happy that we are going to have this dialogue, right? I can think of one thing is love without boundaries, right? Might be problematic, right? So
Mm.
love, if it's just pure sacrifice and you don't have the boundaries that the Father's house gives you, you might end up in a really dire situation, right? So yes, so I think I'm sensitive to what you're saying. Although, yes, I will be leaning, I have to tell you a disclaimer right now, I will be leaning strongly. Uh, my sympathies are with the Mother's house right now, but I think but I still maintain that we need to be able to embrace both in the end. But I won't emphasize the Father's house because we know that one already.
Yeah, no, I
And I'm
agree.
trying to go in a different direction. So, yes, I will be going in very big extremes, but on purpose
Yeah,
so that we can really be really hit, right? I want to hit you with the
no,
Mother's house so that you barely recover. And then of course you have to bring the two together, right? Absolutely. Very good. Let's see. I think let's have one more comment from Giannakopoulos and then I'll move on. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I agree with Justin because, sometimes I think in all our lives we've given too much to somebody or we've been too lenient and they just continue to take. Sometimes if you're too self-sacrificing, too loving, or too lenient, it kind of backfires.
Yeah.
So while the Father's house can be kind of strict and scary even sometimes, we do need to take notes from them, that house, because they also keep us in line when we are not doing the correct thing.
Yes, very good. There's a beautiful passage in the Proverbs which says, let's see. No, it's not in the Proverbs. It's in the Jewish tradition, the idea that we need both justice and love, right? If you have only love, you will be destroyed by evil. If you have only justice, you will not overcome evil. You need the two, right? The balance between the two. So I think in the Jewish tradition, they're deeply aware that you need both houses, right? The house of love, the mother, the house of justice, the father, right? So yes, I tend to think in that way too, although in the class I will be really really over focusing, right, on the mother's house because it was never spoken of, right? Okay, let's go to the last parts of what I have to say. Keep your questions. I'll give you another chance in a bit. Okay, so now I want to do, since you have a vague idea where we are with the mother's house, I want to do a brief initiation so that we are ready to enter, so that we have the right mindset, right? So first of all, I want to say, in spite of the fact that it is really a subversive house, that it is really a house of transgression, right? I want us to pause for a moment and realize that before we enter the mother's house, we have to acknowledge that we are entering a sacred space, right? Just like entering the father's house is a sacred space, also the mother's house, even if it is seems so open and, kind of fluid and still also is a sacred space, right? And like every sacred space, we need to learn to take off our shoes, right? Like Moses at the burning bush. So I will invite you, as very important as you enter this new perspective. And I think this class is going to be okay, but usually when I teach this text, I get a lot of pushback, right? I have taught this text to theologians, right? To pastors. And actually, I was teaching in Korea these texts for 2 weeks. And it was a really interesting experience because for the first week, I was getting what's the word? Like when you throw tomatoes and I was really being crucified here. And so there was a lot of pushback, obviously. But then the second week, there was a shift, right? And people started to really understand what was happening. So this is a class which usually, maybe not so much in this class as I'm feeling you, but it can really provoke a lot of pushback. So I always tell my students, this is sacred ground. You have to also here take off your shoes and enter with respect into the mother's house, right? Entering with an open mind, entering ready to receive what the mother has to teach and listening until the end, right? Because yes, at first you're going to learn some terrible things, right? And so really the invitation to enter respectfully into that house. I know in the Eastern cultures, you take off the shoes, in the Middle East also, right? As a sign of respect. So I'm going to ask all of you, first step of initiation, before you enter, take off your shoes. Meaning, what do I mean by that? Taking off your shoes, what I mean by that is taking off all of what you know, all of what you have been taught, all of your certainties, all of your presuppositions about God, and leaving them at the door so you can receive a new revelation. Let me say that again. Right? To take off the shoes in front of the mother's house is to take off all of your preconceptions, everything that you were taught in the father's house, right? Every image you have of God, every perception you have of gender relations, I want you to leave it at the door so that you can receive this new teaching, right? If you come in with too much baggage from the father's house, you cannot receive the mother's teaching. So I'm not telling you give it up. I'm saying just leave it at the door for now. Is that cool? Are we cool? Can we do this? Put your hand if you're ready, right? I'm not saying give up everything that you've been taught. No. I'm saying please put it at the door for the duration of this class and sit with an open mind, a receptive heart, and see what you can learn. And then you can go out and put on your shoes again. Right? I'm not going to steal your shoes from you. So this is very important, right? That this attitude is there. And I think it's important to realize that this is a healthy thing to do, right? God, when he's asked by Moses his name, do you remember what he says? Anybody know? Remember this scene? Moses is at the burning bush and God is telling him, I will send you to Egypt, right? And Moses is like, well, by the way, what's your name? What do I say? Who do I say sent me? Anybody remember what God tells him? Let's see. Anybody remember the name that God gives him? Rudolph, your hand is up, so I'm going to pick on you. I know you can't put it down.
I could. Now I figured it out. I don't know the answer to your question. My hand was just up from a comment towards Emmanuel earlier, so please.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll come back to you
no
then.
worries.
I'll come back to you. Butterfield, tell us.
I'm not certain, but is this when he referred to himself as the I am?
Yes, right now in the Hebrew, so in English we say I am that I am, which means nothing. In the Hebrew it's different, and it will make a lot of sense. In the Hebrew, actually, the verb is in future. What it actually reads in the Hebrew is I will be who I will be. Make sure you write this down because this is fundamental. If you know this, you will be able to enter the mother's house. I will be who I will be. What does this mean? It means that God is never going to stay one thing. There's always new revelations. There's always broader perspectives to be discovered. God is a dynamic being. In other words, reveals himself dynamically, not statically. Right? So in other words, if you have now a view of God and a view of gender and a view of what it means to be holy and spiritual, know that God has already moved on. And you need to catch up with God, right? And so that's why it's very healthy occasionally to put aside what you know to receive new revelations, right? Because we have to constantly run after this I will be who I will be. Because as soon as we figure something out, he's already over there. I go over there, he's already further. There's always more to discover. That's the point that I'm making, right? And so this exercise I'm asking you to do, to leave your shoes, enter the house, relax, receive, this is actually very, very healthy for you to get a new revelation, right? To move in further towards the I will be who I will be. Okay, now there were a few comments. I want to go back to Rudolph. You had a comment, and then Janakopoulos. Go ahead.
You very eloquently expounded on what I wanted to ask after Emmanuel was done saying that we need to be reminded that we need to come back from mother's house to father's house in order to know what's done right.
Yeah.
The question begs to be asked is, who says that everything is taught in father's house, or who says that the God who lives in father's house is ruling with the truth needed? Perhaps the truth for life on earth is much closer to the God in mother's house than in father's house. So I wouldn't necessarily say, Emmanuel, that we need to be reminded of what's right. It's just questioning, is it right?
Janakopoulos, you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not saying that either house is right, because I have been taught from the mother's house. But what happens is you can see, like, because we're not perfect, right? We're not saints, most of us. So what happens is that we try and be loving and compassionate as much as possible, right? But then one person may take advantage of us, and we find that, hey, with this certain person, we may have to be harsher. Maybe giving 100% love is not the answer, right? So although I have been taught from mother's house, I've also been taught from the father's house. And I know that rules are also very important. So while, like the professor, I sympathize with the mother's house a lot, rules also help us to keep our life, on the right path, so to say. Even though the mother's house is it's like the same God, right? It's still the same path, but it kind of like narrows it a little bit.
Yeah, I think all of us at the end of the class will have to decide how much of the mother's house we want to inhabit, how much of the father's house, right? And all of us are free to either stay in the mother's house, go back to the father's house, or go between, like divorced parents, right? So this is really an individual decision. I think it's personally, I do think it's possible to survive spiritually and being pure mother's house, just like it's possible to survive spiritually and be pure father's house, right? There are people, honestly, who thrive in the father's house and who are amazing people in the father's house, right? That's their thing, right? So I think it depends. We have to decide, each one individually. I'm giving you the missing piece, right? But then in the end, you have to decide, me as a person, where do I belong, right? And I do really think, perhaps unlike Janakopoulos, that it is possible to be completely in the mother's house and still thrive spiritually and emotionally and so forth. And we're going to talk about how, right? Because especially in the Song of Songs, you're going to see Giannakopoulos in the Song of Songs that there are no rules, and yet she succeeds in her relationship. So how, right? The
I
question.
actually want to talk about that, Professor, because I have a great, amazing story. Our Metropolitan of America one time, I'm sorry I talk so much,
Go ahead.
but our Metropolitan of America one time, he told us this story about this one monk who was lazy, you know, never got to church on time. The only time he was ever on time in his life was when it was lunchtime, lunch and dinner and the meals. That's the only time he was ever on time. He didn't do anything. He barely prayed, you know, nothing. But the one thing he excelled at was that he never judged and he always loved. All the other monks would judge him. So, oh, he's so lazy. He doesn't do anything. No chores. He doesn't listen to the Metropolitan, nothing, right? But he never judged. And when he died, they saw angels carrying him into heaven. So yeah, you're right. You know, you can live and survive and prosper in the mother's house because yeah, this monk didn't follow any of the rules, but he loved and never judged, and he was the one that was carried to heaven. So I completely agree with you, brother.
Your brain is very malleable. I like that. You can skip from one place to the next. Very good. That's a good sign, guys. Follow his example. The ability to say this and then be like, oh yeah, this too. This is philosophy, right? This is the ability to move from different worldviews comfortably, right? So here you will be really learning this. This is going to be a really good exercise. Okay, now just a few ground rules for participation. I don't think we'll have problems in this class, but I have just 4 here. I want to say just sometimes I have some funny students, so I made those ground rules back in the day when I had some funny students. So number 1, this is, you're doing this already, right? You always raise your hand before speaking. You don't interject, right? Number 2, try to keep your questions, comments short. This is good. The way you guys are doing it so far is great. Some people, you know, they start to get into long tirades. Don't do that. Right? Breaks the flow. So try to keep your comments short, to the point. Number 3, this is so important. And I think some of you are doing that very nice. I think Rudolph did that very nicely. Stay with the flow. So if your question is, you know, kind of becomes outdated as the class progresses, don't go back, you know, break the flow with your like 10-year-old question, right? So, and you know, you can always stay after class, by the way. If I have a question I didn't address, I'll talk to you after class, right? So, but just try to stay with the flow so that we don't break the flow. And then, of course, this is a very big one. When you say anything or make any argument, you want to make sure it is based on the text. In the past, I've had some people telling me what, you know, kind of like what they believe, and this is not relevant to this class. Whatever you're gonna say, what does the text say? Can you show me in the text backup for what you are arguing for, right? Because sometimes we will disagree on the text, which is healthy, right? I will tell you the text is saying this, and you will say, no, I don't agree with you. That's fine, but you have to show me in the text why I'm wrong. Don't tell me my pastor said that this is wrong, and this is it's not going to be relevant. But try to find in the text some backup, right? Some backup, some support for what you, and I'm perfectly fine. Then I will probably be defeated and say, you're right, this is also there, right? So anytime you make an argument or you want to disagree, it's great, but it must be based on the text. You need to find evidence in the text for what you're saying. So make sure you don't just give me some dogma, right? Or theory that you have been taught. Whatever you're saying needs to have some basis in the text. So those are the ground rules. Okay, guys, this is great. Before I take last questions, if you want, those of you who came late, please stay after. So this is Anderson. I think, Rudolph, you figured out the hand. That's good. I think that the only person who was late was Anderson, right? I don't think anybody else. Most of you got the rest. So please, Anderson, stay after. And then whoever, always, right? If you always want to discuss some more, I'm available after class. I can always stay and talk and answer any more questions, right, that you have. So my office hours are every day after class, right? Okay, so next time, this is what you will do. Just reminding you, you will read Genesis 1 and 2, and you will start writing your questions, right? Your reading assignment. So 2 questions. you know, whether it's in the remez or the drash or the sod, right? You want to try to start digging, right? What does this metaphor mean? Why is the author repeating himself? Why is he switching style? Right? Whatever comes to your mind, what does this mean? Or sometimes in the text there's some detail that you're like, why is he giving this detail? These are good questions, especially the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis is full of details that you're reading and you're like, why is the author bringing this up? Good question. Then we can explore together. Okay, so as you're reading the text is full of little details, repetitions, little hints that the author is hiding in the way that he's writing. That's what I want you to start finding. And then we'll discuss the text together in the class. So your assignment for tomorrow is reading Genesis 1 and 2, doing the reading assignment, making sure the reading assignment is in the drive before class, okay? You need to hand it in before class for it to be accepted, and you need to be present on time in person for you to get the credit. Any questions about anything we did? Yes, Williams, go ahead.
I still don't have access to Blackboard because I think I signed up to your class late.
Okay, great. That's okay because right now you all have the link, right? To everyone who's here found a way in, so take the same way. And then the syllabus, I think someone sent you, but in any case, I will be giving each time the homework, so you don't really need the syllabus for now, right?
Okay.
So, and once, yeah, a couple, like 3 of you are not on Blackboard yet, but you don't need it yet. All you need is a Bible and your questions, and then your reading assignment and your presence in class. So that should be good. Anything else? Butterfield, go ahead.
I was just wondering if anyone in the class could send a link to the Google Drive for those of us not on Blackboard, just so that we can submit the homework for tomorrow.
Oh yeah, okay.
I think, I don't know if someone could just put it in the chat before we leave or something like that.
I'll try right now. Give me a minute.
You're gonna
Thank
do
you.
a couple of, okay, great. Yes, do that. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, great. All right, so I think we finished early, which is nice. So y'all can go. I'll see you tomorrow. Whoever wants to stay behind can stay behind to talk a little bit or take the thing that's in the drive. I'm gonna stop the recording.